Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for attending. We're going to get started. My name is Olivia Juarez. I am the Public Land Program Director at GreenLatinos. We are advocating for our representation of nuestra cultura and our place in the past, present, and future of America through public lands. Welcome to our congressional briefing. Before we get into it, I want to thank all of our sponsors for the GreenLatinos Advocacy Days, for all of the partnership from the organizations, from the individuals that pitch in to bring our communities here so our voices can be heard. So today we're going to have a panel discussion to talk about issues within the Latino climate justice framework, namely the disproportionate issues that affect our Hispanic and Latino communities, with a focus on public land, disinformation, targeting Latino communities, and water quality. Before we get into that panel discussion, which Lou is going to moderate and introduce our panelists you see up here, we have a couple of special elected and appointed officials that are going to join us. And it looks like Representative Vazquez just walked in, rolling in right on time. Thank you. You'll go next. I want to introduce our secretary, our assistant, our deputy assistant secretary of Fish, Parks, and Wildlife, Michael Martinez, who's going to open it up for us. Mr. Martinez was appointed in 2021. Before the appointment at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks within Interior, he served as a policy analyst for the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. His career has also been shaped by 7 years as a natural resources law and policy advisor at USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Over a decade in various roles at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and as a judicial law clerk at the Washington Supreme Court. Mr. Martinez holds a bachelor's degree in natural resources, recreation planning, and management, master's degrees in environmental studies and environmental law, and a Juris Doctor. Mr. Martinez, thank you.
Yeah.
There's a trap on this side. So quiet. Hey, it's great to be with you. Good afternoon, and for those who are traveling, welcome to Washington, D.C. I like this crowd. And I'm pleased to be with you, with the Congressman, and with GreenLatinos during Hispanic Heritage Month. I bring greetings from Secretary Holland and Assistant Secretary Estenos, who are unable to join us today. What I'd like to do today is provide some updates regarding the administration's climate initiatives, and this has been a busy month. Yesterday, Interior Deputy Assistant Secretary for Lands and Minerals Management, Laura Daniel Davis, joined local and state officials for a groundbreaking of Fairview Energy's Cape Station geothermal energy project in Utah. Cape Station will deliver 400 megawatts of carbon-free electricity, provide 6,600 jobs during construction, and 160 full-time jobs throughout its operations. It's expected to begin delivering clean power to the grid in 2026, and full-scale production in 2028. Last week. What day is it?
26.
So it's only Tuesday. There's more to come. But last week, Interior announced $40 million to help tribal communities plug and remediate orphan oil and gas wells across Indian country. This investment supports tribal sovereignty and economic opportunities, addresses legacy pollution, reduces methane leaks, and tackles environmental hazards that threaten tribal communities. This funding is in addition to $560 million in orphan well grant funding that DOI provided to states in 2022, and $100 million that we're also investing in public lands for the same purpose. Meanwhile, President Biden took executive action to launch the American Climate Corps, a workforce training and service initiative that will ensure more young people receive skills-based training for good-paying careers in the clean energy and climate resilience economy. The American Climate Corps will mobilize a new, diverse generation with more than 20,000 jobs for Americans, putting them to work conserving and restoring our lands and waters, bolstering community resilience, deploying clean energy, implementing energy efficiency technologies, and advancing environmental justice. Interior is cooperating with other federal agencies to expand existing youth service corps. Also, the Departments of Energy, Interior, Commerce, and Transportation, through an agreement with 9 states, will provide technical assistance and help develop a shared East Coast procurement and leasing timeline to facilitate greater alignment for offshore wind energy development and generation. That was last week. That was last week for the Department of Interior. There's so much more going on. There were announcements last week from Department of Energy and EPA as well. Earlier this month, the administration and the Department of Interior announced the cancellation of the remaining oil and gas leases issued by the previous administration in the Arctic National Wildlife, and proposed new protections for more than 13 million acres within the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. These actions will help preserve Arctic lands and wildlife while honoring the culture, history, and enduring wisdom of Alaska Natives. Interior earlier this month also announced a new large-scale water recycling program. It made $180 million in bipartisan infrastructure law funding available for projects to create new water supplies that are less vulnerable to drought and climate change. To date, the Bureau of Reclamation has invested $310 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law for projects that advance water recycling and reuse. Reclamation is investing a total of $8.3 billion in bipartisan infrastructure law funds over 5 years for water infrastructure projects, including water purification and reuse, water storage and conveyance, desalination, and dam safety. And in my role, I have purview over the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. I understand some of you will be meeting with the National Park Service tomorrow. The Fish and Wildlife Service has bipartisan infrastructure law funding and is plugging over 240 orphan wells that are actively leaking hydrocarbons, methane, and contaminated water, conducting cleanup and reclamation on 30 plugged wells on 12 national wildlife refuges in Louisiana, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Texas. In Texas, the Fish and Wildlife Service is investing $4 million in bipartisan infrastructure law funding to conduct post-plugging activities for 28 wells on national wildlife refuge lands that are within a 90-minute drive from major urban areas, including Houston, Galveston, Corpus Christi, including the Anwak National Wildlife Refuge and the McFadden National Wildlife Refuge, where the service is restoring wetlands and habitat for sensitive nesting species, and at the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, where the service is reclaiming 2 abandoned tank batteries in whooping crane habitat. Also through the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a sagebrush conservation program, and it's implementing 150 projects in the western states to conserve strategic areas within the sagebrush ecosystem, to safeguard precious water resources for neighboring communities and wildlife, and using bipartisan infrastructure law funds through the State Sagebrush Ecosystem Restoration Fund to control invasive species and wildlife. Just a couple of more. At Cabo Rojo National Wildlife Refuge, Interior is investing more than $3.5 million to upgrade infrastructure to be more climate resilient and create a better visitor experience. Also in Puerto Rico, Protectores de Cuenca will restore 107 acres of coastal wetlands in the Punta Tuna National Reserve, damaged by Hurricane Maria, through $510,000 from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so I think I'm out of time, But I want to make sure that you're aware of $200 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law over 5 years to restore fish passage by removing dams and culverts, among other barriers. We want to work with you in your watersheds to improve aquatic habitat. Look for our next notice of funding opportunities in the fall. And tomorrow I expect to be with some of you where I can talk about the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program, a National Park Service grant program which provides grants to improve recreational opportunities in disadvantaged communities. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention President Biden's national monument designations in Latinx regions of the country, including the restoration of Bears Ears National Monument, and Grant's Staircase Escalante, Ave Qua Ame in New Mexico, the National Monument in Nevada, Ancestral Footprints of the Grand Canyon National Monument in Arizona, Kastner Range National Monument in Texas, and let's not forget Camp Hale, Continental Divide National Monument in Colorado. Like I said, we've been very busy over the last 2.5 years, and we have much more to do. We look forward to working with you as we finish what we've started. Thanks for this opportunity to be with you.
Thank you so much. Los GreenLatinos, ¿cómo estamos? A ver, Latinos Verdes, ¿cómo estamos? Eso, así me gusta. My name is Ángel Damián Soto Peña, and I appreciate you all being here in this town today to deliver the appropriate spanks and thanks to the folks who need to hear it. And so just a round of applause for all of you guys today, for your work and your commitment to the community. I really appreciate that. I am the privileged executive director of the Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project. I am a proud Green Latino, and above all, have the honor to call our next speaker up as not only my friend, my colleague, a doer of cool, crazy ideas, but also the guy, when I talk to my mom, right, she'll be like, ¿Dónde andas? And I'll be like, oh, pues ya sabes, Mom. She goes, ah, no, estás con el Gabe, ¿verdad? I'm like, yeah, yep. And he is also the representative of Congressional District 2 here, or there in southern New Mexico, and a great friend. And so with that, I want to introduce Representative Vazquez up here to help us kind of leverage the energy, the momentum, and really put us on the right track so we can continue to do the good work that we Latinos and the Indio Hispanos know how to do. So Mr. Vazquez, Representative Vazquez, please.
Man, this is my carnal right here. I wish everybody introduced me that way. Es un placer estar aquí con ustedes. As a kid who grew up in Ciudad Juárez in the Chaveño neighborhood and went to New Mexico and got to see the canopy of stars underneath me when I went camping for the first time, and box turtles come in from the grass, and truly understand how precious water was in our communities when we fish for catfish. Those are the type of experiences that as Latinos all across the country we have that are very personal to us, that brings conservation home, that makes these issues so incredibly important. And so when I was able to win this district, I said, what are the conservation priorities that we're going to have, right? What are we going to do to make land better, not just for recreation, but for sustainability, for culture, right? Not just for the farmers, but for the farm workers. Not just for the present, but for the future. And that was really important to me. And so that's what we're working on right now in a district that is larger than the state of Pennsylvania, and that has places like the beautiful Gila River, the last free-flowing river in the southwest, that has beautiful places like the Rio Bravo, which I know Angel also calls it the Rio Bravo, because when I grew up, in Mexico, we call it the Rio Bravo, the brave river. It's not that brave anymore because we've dammed it all to hell. But it is still the Rio Grande. because that grandness of the river still means a lot to us. But I do want to thank today Green Latinos. I want to thank Nuestra Tierra, and I want to thank all of you for being here today and for showing up in Washington, D.C. Muchas gracias. And I also want to give a shout out to Albert Arevalo, who is an old-time friend of mine. I was here on the Hill 7 years ago working on child welfare policy. I was trying to get the Children's Health Insurance Program reauthorized. I was trying to get the McKinney-Vento Act reauthorized. I was working on smoking and vaping regulations at all HUD-designated housing facilities across the United States. And then I got a call from somebody that said, you should get involved with this Latino Outdoors thing while you're here, because there's not many of us. And I said, no, I think there's a lot of us. But if you want me to, I will. And so Albert and I became Latino Outdoors leaders here in Washington, D.C. And we took people out kayaking on the Potomac, we took people on bike rides, we took people out to Rock Creek Park. And it was all to get our Latino community to better appreciate not just nature, but what conservation truly means, what sustainability truly means to future generations. And so before I ever even thought about becoming a congressperson, I was working as a volunteer for Latino Outdoors for 2 years. And after that, Angel and I hatched an idea to start an organization called Nuestra Tierra. And we did that successfully. And then we created what we call the New Mexico Outdoor Equity Fund in New Mexico, which is now a $1+ million program that helps underserved youth, our tribal youth, our youth of color, be able to get outdoors and experience and have those same experiences that I did con mi papá y con mi abuelo. So that is truly the importance of why we do this work. That is why we're all here today. It's not just about the policy, it's about the people, it's about the culture, it's about the natural resources. And to our panelists that are here today, I just want to say thank you for taking the time, thank you for being leaders, and I won't hold you up anymore because we don't have any much more time to spare. Muchas gracias, es un placer estar aquí con ustedes.
All right, well, I want to thank Congressman Vazquez and Deputy Assistant Secretary Martinez for their words. My name is Luis Medina, you can call me Lou. I will be moderating today's panel, but before I introduce myself, I want to introduce our panelists. I want to thank GreenLatinos for getting us all together here. To my right, your left, is Victor Guillen Febres. Victor has a master's in public policy and is the communications and counter-disinformation strategist for United We Dream, the largest immigrant youth-led network in the country. Victor has led nationwide anti-disinformation programs that are designed to protect Latino Latinx communities from harmful effects of disinformation, particularly during important election cycles. His efforts extend to countering the radicalization of young men of color through innovative gaming research, holding tech companies and federal agencies accountable. So that's a little bit about Victor. Then to his right, your left, is Latricia Adams. Latricia is a proud native of Memphis, Tennessee, and is the founder, CEO, and president of Black Millennials for Flint, which is a national environmental justice and civil rights organization that brings like-minded organizations together to collectively take action and advocate against the crisis of lead exposure, specifically in African American and Latino Latinx communities. Latricia is a proud HBCU graduate, a K-12 educator, and the youngest African American woman appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She was doing a very important presentation for WeJack, which she kind of did virtually and finished on time to be with us today. And then to her right, your left, is Albert Arevalo. He is a volunteer program coordinator for the DC, Maryland, and Virginia areas for Latino Outdoors, a nonprofit that connects Latino communities with outdoor experiences and advocacy. Albert is a senior Chesapeake Regional Fellow for the Environmental Leadership Program and leads the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Subcommittee for the establishment of a new national park, the Chesapeake National Recreation Area. He has a bachelor's in sociology from Texas State University and has a master's in sociology from New Mexico State University. So that's a little bit about Albert. And a little bit about myself. My name is Lou Medina. Like I said, I am the Communications and Philanthropy Director for a small conservation nonprofit based in Bishop, California, called Friends of the Inyo. Our mission is to protect and care for the public lands and waters of the Eastern Sierra region of California. And I am so grateful to GreenLatinos for a very special reason, and that is that 2 years ago when I joined Friends of the Inyo, I was the first ever bilingual staff member in an organization that until then had an all-white board, had only ever before me hired one other person of color. Now we have 2 bilingual people on staff. We have a Native American on staff, and we have a trans person on staff. Diversity is happening. This is happening very organically, but our board still needs a lot of help and guidance about how to do, diversity, equity, and inclusion right. And I think that just by having us hitch our wagon, as they say, to GreenLatinos, this is helping us a whole lot. So very grateful to be here. And with that, let's get started, all right? So we have some prepared questions for each of our panelists, and we're just gonna go in order. And it'll be a question with then a follow-up question or 2 for each of them until we get through all that we have to talk about. So the first question is for Victor, all right? United We Dream has reported on Latino-targeted disinformation campaigns intended to mislead the public about topics like elections and immigration. How does this connect to the climate crisis and the climate issues that disproportionately affect Latinos, such as extreme weather events, displacement, climate, migration, participation in public processes, and more? It's a big question, but...
Bueno, buenas tardes, ¿cómo estamos? Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much, Luis, for that question. Thank you for everybody who came here in spite of the gloomy weather. I just came from Miami, so I'm definitely feeling the difference. My name is Victor Guillen. I am the counter-disinformation strategist at United We Dream. Like Luis said, it is the largest undocumented immigration youth-led organization and network in the country. And since our inception, we have fought really hard to make sure that we push back against lies, conspiracy theories, and anti-immigrant narratives that were spread online. During the implementation of DACA back in 2012, we provided resources to our communities to make sure that our people weren't scammed by notarios and by lawyers that wanted to take advantage of the excitement of that time. During the 2020 census, we made sure that our communities had the resources to be counted in the census. I'm fighting against this information that was trying to spread lies about that census, so our undocumented communities were not counted. In the lead up of the 2020 and 2022 elections, we made sure to create very powerful programs on WhatsApp to inoculate our Latinx communities against this information. And as we know, WhatsApp is one of the places where our communities spend the most time. We see racialized disinformation as an existential threat to all brown, black, and immigrant communities of color. And this is why we take it so seriously. These issues are actually very personal to me as well. I am an immigrant from Venezuela. And I have seen how, I see other people from Venezuela here, amazing. And I have seen how disinformation is used to essentially weaponize the trauma of our immigration stories to divide and confuse our communities. During the 2020 presidential election, I saw how many of my close friends and families in South Florida were aggressively targeted with disinformation in Spanish, with the sole purpose of dividing, confusing our communities and to gain some sort of political or electoral gain. This Spanish-speaking or Spanish language disinformation was surrounding the vaccines, climate change, immigration, and in particular, the results of the 2020 presidential election. This content was shared by large Venezuelan accounts. It spread like fire on WhatsApp, Telegram, YouTube, and a lot of other Spanish media outlets that pick up this sort of narrative. A lot of the election disinformation that targeted my close friends and families actually surrounded the narrative that the 2020 presidential election here in the US was very similar to the sham elections that happened in Venezuela held by President Maduro. And that actually polarized a lot of my close friends and families, radicalized a lot of people that I know, and damaged a lot of the relationships that we had in our community that is already facing a lot of trauma because of the immigration that we have been facing. But why do bad actors spread this information? Let's not forget that by 2024, we are gonna be, Latinos I mean, we're gonna be up to 14% of all eligible voters in the US. We have so much political power that we're being able to determine critical elections in places like South Florida, right? And bad actors know this, and they target our communities intentionally to essentially divide us and confuse us. To answer your question, Luis, climate change disinformation is actually extremely pervasive in communities of color, and we have a lot of reports and research that suggests that TikTok is actually targeting a lot of Latino and communities of color with Spanish language disinformation, spreading lies about the environment, spreading climate change conspiracy theories. These lies usually go under the radar on TikTok and actually violate the content moderation rules that their own platform is supposed to perform and enforce. Let's not forget also that in the 3 states with the highest population of Latinos, California, Texas, and Florida, our communities are the ones that get impacted the most by climate change. So we are the communities that are the most impacted by climate disinformation, and simultaneously we are the communities that are also the most affected by it. We also have the issue of climate migration. Climate migration is displacing a lot of people from Latin America and the global south that are finding refuge here in the United States. And it is precisely the freedom to move and the lack and need of a humane refugee system in the US that is creating a lot of disinformation, and bad actors are weaponizing this to spread disinformation against immigrants and xenophobic content online. It is not just TikTok either. There is significant research showing that Spanish language disinformation on platforms like YouTube and Meta do not enforce the same level of content moderation policies as they do in English. Let's keep in mind that this content is usually directly translated from English. It is taken down in English, but in Spanish it remains for much longer. This is particularly concerning because we know that Spanish-speaking households are up to 12% more likely to rely on platforms like YouTube for primary sources of information. Our sister organization, United Dream Action, actually did some research into Latino media consumption patterns in immigration and found that YouTube, for instance, was a huge platform where our communities get information firsthand. The same goes for Meta. On April 2020, we found that I hate saying Meta, so I say Facebook. It's hard to say Meta at this point, same with X. But yeah, not gonna do that. But yeah, we found out that Facebook actually flagged to take down and report up to 70% of all the COVID-related disinformation in Spanish. This was actually during a time that where we actually needed really good information, and our communities desperately needed a response against the healthcare emergency. So United Dream has actually supported a lot of bills that were introduced in the Senate by Senator Lujan and in the House by Representative Cárdenas. It's called the Listos Act. This bill requires social media companies to essentially consistently communicate and enforce the same level of content moderation across different languages, and to make sure that they follow the processes and the same resources for content moderation and automated translation. To finalize, social media companies also profit a lot from this kind of misinformation. They actively profit the harmful narratives that are spread online because of the harmful business models. An investigation by the Tech Transparency Project found that Meta actually monetizes the searches of white supremacist groups through ads and uses its algorithm to promote conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement Theory, which many of you might know has led to actual deadly violence in places like Buffalo, New York, and El Paso, Texas. Not to mention that this also keeps our society extremely polarized, and it gets in the way from passing extremely important meaningful reform in immigration, such as providing a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented people in this country. I share the story of my family and my friends in South Florida because it is important to highlight that people use social media to find community, to relate with one another, especially for immigrants. We do it to stay in touch with our family as well. And so we want to make sure that people are able to still do those things while also being safe and protected from this kind of content. We believe that Congress has the responsibility and the power to make sure that these companies expose and disclose their algorithms, their business models, enforce equal content moderation across all different platforms, and most importantly, they come to the table with real solutions to meet our community's needs. Thank you.
A follow-up question that I have for you, because you've talked a lot about disinformation, has to do with potential lack of information. So the National Association of Hispanic Journalists used to put out a report called the Brownout Report, which they actually stopped putting out, I think, in the last decade. And it was basically what they discovered was a lack of coverage of Latinos, except for two issues, immigration and crime. Because, of course, you know, the stereotype is they're all illegal immigrants and they're all criminals, right? But do you think that there is a lack of coverage now on just the regular news media related to climate issues that affect the Latino community?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It has like so many parts to it. One part is that there is definitely a content void of good immigration stories and good Latino stories online, but mostly because of what I mentioned earlier, which is the business model that most of these tech platforms and most of these media outlets have. They put maximizing engagement above everything else, which essentially means that obviously it's going to be more profitable for them to put upsetting images of the border as opposed to creating educational content about the climate, right? We need to make sure that we disclose those business models and that we disclose the type of algorithms that they have so people can actually look into them and ban certain algorithms if needed. The second part is we also need data privacy. Because the reason why these algorithms are so effective at feeding you what works to keep you engaged is because they collect your commercial data without you consenting to it. So we need to enforce data privacy to make sure that we protect our communities for this content void and that we actually share meaningful educational information, and these platforms are used for good and not to divide and confuse people, especially our Latino communities.
Thank you very much for that. And next, we'll go to Latricia. And here's your first question. Latricia, at Black Millennials for Flint, you tend to punch above your weight, quote unquote, as you advocate for clean, healthy drinking water for communities. What has been your experience with coalition building as it relates to organizing for environmental liberation?
Sure. So first, I'm still taking in so much I have learned from my colleague here, still internalizing that. Thank you so much for this opportunity to serve on this panel. So to answer your question, I'm a storyteller. So I want to kind of frame this from an anecdotal perspective. So with Black Millennials for Flint, of course, with our namesake, we were devastated when we learned about what happened in Flint, Michigan, but we soon learned thereafter it's not just Flint, Michigan, but literally rooms that look like us is where we see issues surrounding not just lead in drinking water, but just water quality issues altogether. But something that, still sits with me We did our first, it was a lot going on in the beginning of the Flint water crisis, but we did, in the beginning, we did a myriad of things. So we did canvassing, specifically at that particular point in time, and this is a bit more hyper-local. So essentially, in the beginning of the Flint water crisis, people were paying in Flint, Michigan, some of the highest water rates in the country. We're talking about water that you could not drink, that you could not really safely bathe in. You were literally paying for poison. And so at that particular time, there was a petition for a call to action for the governor, at that time, Snyder, to essentially put a moratorium on water bills. So we did two things when we were canvassing. One, we were trying to provide information to get people amped up to say, we're not paying these, we're not paying for poison, but then also doing water distribution. During this particular point in time, it was very, and it still is, very contentious as it related to homeland security and the amount of fear that was instilled in immigrant populations. So when we were doing door-to-door canvassing, we have water, we have these resources, and it literally drove me to tears when we got to a largely Latinx community, literally like would not open the doors, would not even accept the water because of fear, because Homeland Security literally had been in those communities trying to invoke fear in these community members. And so at that moment, more than ever before, I'm like, it is critical for us to do coalition building. So literally in that moment, just a community organizer canvassing, if I had not experienced that and seen that firsthand, that would not have necessarily been a strategy that would have been implemented, right? So it's critical that when we think about coalition building, we're trying to reach community, not only to provide resources, but to amplify the voices of people who are oftentimes invisible. So in a place like Flint, it is largely African American, but you have a thriving Latinx community. But because it's so small, it takes coalition building so that those nuances that are very specific to the Latinx community in this instance is amplified. If we had not been boots on the ground, that would have been, again, just invisible and not amplified. So that's one story. I want to bring it to Washington, D.C., still local. So this is literally in the same year, so this is in 2016, where we were founded here in the district, came back to the District of Columbia literally after leaving Flint, Michigan, and found out that there was lead in school drinking water right here in the District of Columbia. So one of our big things that we like to do is canvassing. I am from a southern state. We knock on your door, we don't care, we're all family, we'll come to your house. And so when we learned about this issue with lead in school drinking water, boots on the ground, we started to canvass again. If you are from the DC area, not from the DC area, the majority of Black and brown people live east of the river, so in Ward 7 and Ward 8, and so that's where we started to do canvassing. Specifically in Ward 8 and dearly in the Anacostia community, we came across a challenge that was different from what we saw in Flint, but very important. We went to a particular home. There was a Spanish-speaking family in this home, and at the time, all the information that went out to students, and this was interesting because I used to be a former teacher, they sent it home with the kids, right? Like, is this really gonna make it to the parents? But essentially, the biggest thing that we learned in that moment is this parent, and she had children, 3 children under the age of 6 in that home, was completely oblivious that her school, that her students or children attended, she had no idea that they had elevated lead levels. You wanna know why? Because no notifications went out in Spanish. And so something that seems like so small and trivial, it was not. So again, like in that moment, okay, so I'm already like fuming about what was happening in Flint. To see in our nation's capital the same thing, and it all was grounded in lack of language access. It was heartbreaking, and dare I say criminal, that this parent was completely unaware that her child was at risk, or children were at risk. And so in that moment, you know, we were able to make sure that that parent got what they needed, but it was a larger issue. To bring this more to a national landscape and to a federal perspective, if you notice specifically with this administration, and it's not perfect, there has been a big emphasis on language accessibility, essentially not just from the perspective of just educating, but for people to have access to advocate for themselves. And so why it's important to make that connection to coalition building, it's important, especially with people of color, that we do not work in silos. If we work to introduce policy and there's gaps, then the policy is in vain, right? So it's important that we work together, that we hear stories. That's why I led with storytelling. It's important for us to share narratives with each other so that we come together to advocate for policy, whether it be at the federal level, whether it be at the state level or local level, that we're one united front, but we still have our identity as we show up into those spaces of advocacy. And it has to be shared anger, right? That made me mad. But forgive being sad, that made me extremely upset that you have parents, one, because of discriminatory actions that may not necessarily reflect my culture, my experiences, but it doesn't matter. We have to be the same amount of upset and mad, not just sad, when we go into spaces of advocacy. So when we think about coalition building, again, it's not just from an educational perspective, which is really important. It's important that we show up into these institutions of power, and dare I say, that are governed by white supremacy, and recognize that that is the enemy.
Yeah.
And when we band together, that's our best bet to defeat white supremacy. That's always the opposition, right? And it's important that when we work collaboratively, that we are aligned with our strategy, that we are also aligned with, again, I'm gonna keep saying that angry part, it makes me think about Malcolm X. When you're mad is when you start to see change, right? And so in addition to that, I think about some of the triumphs that we have seen. So we see the unprecedented investment with the Inflation Reduction Act. That took a lot of coalition building. It took a lot of storytelling. It took a lot of bringing in grassroots efforts into a federal landscape. I also want to emphasize that point where grassroots is so critical in any movement. We can't just exist with only engaging with federal advocates and federal legislators. It has to be the full spectrum. So it starts from the bottom up, right? If we truly honor the Jimenez principles, then that's what we're supposed to do anyway, right? Yeah. So we should not have people to come into our communities and say, hey, can you sign on to this? Who else has experienced that before? Like, hey, this is a sign-on letter, but did you engage community the first time before you drafted this, before you talked about this policy? Did it actually reflect community? And I think that, again, us working as a united front is really critical for us not to keep moving forward, and we can celebrate some of the wins, but we know that we have such a long ways to go. But the important part that I want to reiterate outside of just coalition building is the storytelling and making sure that we are in control of our own narrative, and it's not informed from a white narrative, that it comes directly from our mouths about what our experiences are to best shape the policies that will impact and truly give us access to democracy and healthy communities and environments.
My follow-up question has to do with, like, in your coalition building efforts, who or what were some of the strangest bedfellows you encountered? You know, organizations that you never would have thought to partner with, but that surprised you, and then who were they and how did they help?
So before I name an organization, I want to uplift a conversation that I will never forget. It was really funny. So the late, great Congressman Lewis, I had an opportunity to meet him, this was 2016 was a big year for Black millennials from Flint. So had an opportunity to meet him. Of course, at that particular point in time, we were all things like, there's got to be some federal policy around lead. We had some big wins in lead this year, but look how long it took, but a win is a win. But essentially what he said, and I was not prepared for this, is he asked me, who have you engaged on the other side of the aisle? And this is young Latricia, so my face kind of shifted a little bit because I didn't expect for him to ask me that question. And so I said, nobody. Nobody on the other side of the aisle, right? And so what he said at that moment was, you can't get things passed if you don't engage on the other side of the aisle. And so I was like, man, you're absolutely right. And I'm like, how do we do that? Because some people on the other side of the aisle hate people that look like me. So how do I do that? And so literally in that moment, some of your big green organizations that don't necessarily have a good history, a track record with engagement with communities of colors, we needed them. So when we talk about allyship, when we talk about strategy, we have to see it for what it is. So to get big bills passed, like what we just saw within this current administration, it took people being able to engage on the other side of the aisle. But it couldn't be me that goes into those offices. And being okay with that in the moment from a strategic perspective, and literally I will say our most bold and emphatic statement with holding allies accountable is being very plain to say, your role as a white individual is to go and talk to your people. Essentially, is to talk to your people and for you to encourage them to do the right thing. That shouldn't be, the onus should not be on people of color to do that, right? It behooves allies to act in their role and to engage your people to make the right decision for the better good. So I would say, especially like since 2020, we have really been strategic, and it was a culture shift, I'm not gonna lie. We call Black millennials for Flint, so that was really difficult to figure out how we're going to incorporate this into how we operate, but we literally, unfortunately, in the landscape that we live in, we have to lean on true allyship to be able to get things accomplished that is for the better good for all of us.
Thank you. All right, and then our final panelist, Albert, here's the question for you. You have been advocating for the creation of the Chesapeake National Recreation Area. Can you tell us a bit about that proposal and how it specifically impacts frontline community access to public lands?
Sure, thank you. Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to be amongst very distinguished panelists. I kind of like being last because I get to reflect a lot on what you both shared. Victor, when you were sharing about misinformation, I was also thinking about my own misinformation that I was fighting, and I didn't think about this until recently, well, like now. But something my mom told me was, your dreams don't pay the bills. And that's something that kind of, I felt defeated at the very beginning, but I'm a very stubborn person. You can tell my husband, and he will validate that. So, us being here in this space just shows that there is career for us. Just being here is something that we can make a visible presence and kind of inspire a younger version of yourself that might see themselves kind of looking for inspiration. And I also do want to share that I am also a storyteller, and I do want to share something briefly before I dive into my questions. So I am a lover of public lands, but I'm very biased to the Park Service. I fell in love with the Park Service at Rock Creek Park. I fell in love at a national park, national monument, MLK. I proposed at a national monument, which is Stonewall, and we had our honeymoon at multiple parks around Utah. So being in a space where I can actually share my compassion and my own personal journey, talking about that own misinformation that I'm kind of constantly fighting is something that's very refreshing, because you find yourself in these situations where you are one of the few people that are, that look like yourself. But yeah, I'm remiss and I won't fall into a rabbit hole or another soap opera story. But in regards to the Chesapeake National Recreation Area, it's a land-based proposal that would be park access around the Chesapeake Bay. So this idea, and I love how the question is phrased I am the sole person, which is not true. This idea has been in formulation for over 30 years. So when people say things
go very slow on the hill, it's true. But it's a long idea coming, which is extremely exciting. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland and Congressman Sarbanes introduced a bill in July to create this new national park, new national recreation area. The Chesapeake Bay is very privatized in access to getting into the actual water, or even accessing the land. So this idea would actually allow individuals, especially people of color, to have access to some of these spaces that historically have been in the ownership of private landowners. One of the few times I will boast about being from Texas is now. So one thing that I really pride the state in, one of a few things, is public access to beaches. And that's something that is shared by all Texas citizens. And that's something that is innate to me. Like just going into the Gulf of Mexico, going to a beach is so instinctual to me. So I think that should be something that everybody should have access to. Within the Chesapeake region, we do have a lot of state parks that provide us access, but we shouldn't be limiting ourselves to only certain places where they tell us that we should be able to recreate. Something that I really loved, and having Gabe, Congressman Vazquez, it's still weird, is just extremely refreshing, and it's something that I've evolved in my mindset is like advocacy through play. And if we can't recreate in some of these places, how can I tell people like you should defend these places? So that's something that I am like very like a big advocate for. Play is kind of like my niche. But that's also a privilege, and I think that's something that I have to acknowledge and recognize. Like, the American dream is like, okay, work, which is great. What do you do for unwinding? What do you do for a reprise, to catch your breath? I think that's something that the national parks do for the country, and a way for us to kind of memorialize something that is extremely important is by giving it that designation of the shield of NPS. It's world renowned. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the US. It is a national treasure, and I think having an opportunity, and it's exciting that hearing you all will be able to speak to other folks from the Park Service. The thing that's as exciting that they get to hear about this, which is great, but to your point as well, like you have to reach across the aisle to kind of get support. The great thing about this is that there is bipartisan support, at least in the inception, to kind of create this park, this recreation area, but just having the opportunity to share that and like preach about like getting more parks is wonderful. But yeah, it's one thing to designate and create as many national parks as possible. But it's another thing to make sure that the appropriate funding for the Park Service and the Department of Interior and these other services are continuously being increased. It shouldn't be fair that the Park Service should be working on a shoestring budget, which it has been for so long. And as new national parks, and hopefully a new national recreation area locally is being created, they shouldn't be scrapping for nickel and dimes to kind of make this thing happen. I don't know if I answered all the questions.
Yeah. And then, just a quick follow-up to, you talked about some barriers to access, but what other barriers have you noticed possibly in the population that you serve? One of them that I've noticed for communities of color is just cost of going out and recreating in nature, lack of information, websites that maybe are not translated into Spanish. What other things have you noticed as barriers to recreation for Latinos and other underrepresented communities?
All the above that you mentioned, and I think there's also that misinformation that is also kind of ingrained with a lot of individuals. Just a genuine fear of the outside or the unknown. So I think that's something that we try to kind of work, is just like kind of create rapport with our communities and kind of ensure that they feel comfortable with us, so we can showcase them to these experiences. So I think, separate from all that language is also very challenging. I'm a volunteer for Latino Outdoors. I do environmental work as well, but something that has been extremely rewarding is to the point about coalition building is as an organization, shout out to Latino Outdoors celebrating 10 years. When Congressman Vazquez was here, it was just a completely different ballgame. We were with the shoestring budget. So it's just kind of making sure that these opportunities were as amazing as possible, and ensuring that we eliminated as many barriers, whether it's transportation, it's cost, language. I think all these exist. And being part of a coalition separate from GreenLatinos, but to create a new national recreation area is to also be vocal about ensuring that language access is also part of the conversation, especially when a lot of, I don't have the figure on top of my head, but a lot of Latinx individuals, their first language is Spanish. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, especially that we have a very large Salvadoran community, Central American community that lives in the DMV. We want to make sure that we are respectful to individuals and that they feel that their voices and the information that's accessible to them can be understood.
Well, thank you. Let's give them all a hand. For educating us on so many important issues that are affecting our communities. I think we're going to end on time, Olivia.
We have time for one or two audience questions.
Okay. So does anybody have a question for any one of our panelists? Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I would never ask questions. Thank you all for an incredible panel. I learned so much from every one of y'all. My question is for Latricia, but anyone can jump in. I really resonated, and it was really eye-opening to hear your remarks on allyship and Big Greens and the relationship also with the other side of the aisle. And my question would be how in your experience and in the experience of Black millennials for Flint have y'all navigated not having, I guess, Big Greens overpower or derail the vision and essence of the legislation or initiatives that y'all work on, and let it be so washed down where you're wait. I asked y'all to do this and it's something completely different. So would love to hear your remarks on that and how you draw that line.
Yeah, so I would say being a bit audacious on the front end and being very clear what we want their role to be. And if that agreement is broken, all bets off. It's literally that black and white. And that, I can definitely say that has happened before. So I'm a storyteller again. I want to actually, and this is a little bit interesting, but I want to use the Inflation Reduction Act as an example. So while the Inflation Reduction Act, it's to be celebrated, but there were some parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that was icky, and people in small EJ grassroots organizations during that whole time leading up to the passing were very vocal about what those things that did not feel good, that people that look like us would be impacted the most. And so one particular organization, essentially when once the Inflation Reduction Act was released and it was celebrations and all of that, we said you did not uphold your end of the bargain. As a Big Green organization, we specifically told you what these things were that were not good, that were a big compromise, that you, as a white-facing organization, you didn't have the compromise, but we did. And people that we serve in our community did. And so it literally was that cut and dry, all bets off. You did not fulfill your duty as an ally. And so we can't play with you anymore. Wow. Essentially what it was. Now it was risky, and to the degree, or we know with some Big Greens, they provide funding. Let's be clear, we don't care. So we have to take that as a loss, but still maintain our integrity, because we cannot sign up for things that we know are going to be harmful. I would say when we did that, a lot of organizations felt more compelled to speak out against that. And some people from GreenLatinos probably even know who I'm talking about, but being very vocal, saying like, like this part is good, but you didn't listen to us or did do your job as an ally when we really needed you the most. All you had to do is just say it. Right? So I think like setting up like those norms like from the beginning and having an agreement, and not even necessarily like a formal agreement where you type things up, but just like a social contract, if you will. And if that's broken, all bets off, we're not friends anymore, essentially.
Beautiful. Thank you for that insight.
Anybody else have a question? Yes.
For Latricia as well. In Houston, we're battling with some issues similar. Our Southeast water plant is about to get privatized as well. We're dealing with lead issues in our HISD as well. So if you could start organizing from the beginning, what is something that you would do as form of strategy to prevent any of this?
Yes, so that's actually a big area of expertise that we have when Let's Connect Offline, specifically around lead and school drinking water. We leaned on parents so hard when we were trying to get, before like our national impact, we got a bill passed here in 2017 in Washington, D.C. It's a long name, but it's called the D.C. Childhood Lead Prevention Amendment Act of 2017. I did not come up with that name. It is still the strongest bill in the country, and so we've been using that as a blueprint to get it passed in other states, because unfortunately, unless something magical happens with the release of the lead and copper rules, the updates, it's not a federal mandate. But what helped us is parents and diversity of parents. We're talking about allyship, white parents, I'm just gonna be honest. When white children are impacted, people listen. Is that morally like wrong? Yeah. But we gotta do what we gotta do. So once white children and white families were impacted and they started to be really vocal, that's when we started to see some transition. For example, here in the district, and remember I mentioned Ward 7 and Ward 8, where a lot of black and brown people are. Actually, the first whistleblower around there being colored water was in Malcolm X Elementary School, majority black school, and Ward 8 in Acacia. And they have been screaming from the top of their lungs, like, my kid's water is brown, right? And so it even went viral, like on social media, like, this water is brown. DC Council did not respond until the parents at Capitol Hill Montessori also started to have bouts with lead in their drinking water. Now that's extremely problematic. Now, did we lean in on those parents at DC Montessori? Absolutely. But when we went before DC Council, we held them accountable and said, you didn't listen to this whistleblower parent that was east of the river. We're glad that we have allyship, but you need to listen to everybody. So we still held them accountable. Unfortunately, and I hate that it's set up that way, if you can get white parents to be very vocal about that, then things will shift. It's a coalition building part, but let's connect offline.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, thank you very much for all of that. Closing, I just want to say that, I love coming to Washington, D.C. because it's the kind of place that allows you to dream, right? Whether that dream is to create knowledge that's something other than disinformation, for people to be able to live lives of quality and lives of safety, whether it's protecting very vulnerable communities using whatever means at your disposal to do it, whether it's opening up a new public land, for people to actually build milestones, life milestones in them. And I want to leave, this, I want to close with my dream, with the dream that I have on this visit. This is my dream, and I'm glad Mr. Martinez is here to hear it. I would really like to see some of the silos broken down, and I would love to see two agencies that are as dissimilar to each other as the National Park Service and USCIS work together so that at every swearing-in ceremony, when we have new citizens coming into the country, they each get a year's National Parks Pass as a gift, as a welcome to America gift. Because our national parks are like the best that we have to offer Canada goes overboard with giving things to their new citizens. We don't give anybody anything, but I tell you, it costs several $100s to apply, yeah, voter registration. But it costs several $100s to apply for citizenship. I'm sure that more than covers the value of a national parks pass. And if you give one to someone who's 62 or older, it becomes a lifetime pass, you know? Or if you give it to someone who is in the military or a veteran, because we do have non-citizens who do serve in the military, then it's a gift for their service as well. So this is my dream. This is part of what I'm advocating for in the, you know, I walk the halls of Congress with the California team #1. We're looking for a name. We're the dream team. All right, so anyway, I would like to encourage everyone with what you've heard from our panelists today to just dream big, and make it the most worthwhile visit to our nation's capital. You know, there's so much to inspire here, the monuments. We came out of Union Station today feeling like, oh my God, this is so beautiful, right? So just let the beauty of Washington, D.C. and the opportunity that Green Latinos has given us in gathering us here, and even giving scholarships to some of us to come here. Who does that, right? So dream and go forth and get allies from both sides of the aisles to help you fulfill whatever dream you brought to DC with you. Thank you.